latest Smart Irrigation Month Bringing Water to Life webinar, part of our 2014 series. This webinar is entitled The Ogallala Aquifer, the Role of Irrigation for a Sustainable Future. My name is John Farner. I'm on staff here with the Irrigation Association. And welcome to the webinar. We really appreciate you attending. Once again, we seem to outdo ourselves every time. This is, judging by the folks who registered for this webinar, this may very well be our largest one yet. So we at the Irrigation Association are very excited about that. I promised our two speakers that I would only take a very limited amount of time to kind of set the stage here, because I want to get into the meat of what these presentations are going to be. So we'll go ahead and get started. First, we are the Irrigation Association. I know a lot of you, this is your first time interacting with this association. We are the leading membership organization for water management companies and professionals in agriculture, landscape, and golf. Basically, we're horizontally and vertically integrated, representing anywhere from the manufacturers, dealers, distributors, consultants, contractors, and anything irrigation in the agricultural, turf, or landscape field. Really quickly, our strategic plan is simple. We have a vision and a mission. Our vision is to be the recognized authority on irrigation. Our mission is to promote efficient irrigation. And the one way we promote both of these is to hold webinars like this and really open up doors for the experts in the field to reach out to interested parties. We know how important the Ogallala Aquifer is, not only to irrigation, but the overall agricultural sector of the United States. So we're really excited about this topic, looking at irrigation, how it relates to the Ogallala, what's being done right now, and efforts underway to continue the discussion, which this webinar is only a very small part of. I'm going to just throw some numbers out here on the webinar. A lot of these are debatable. I'm not one here to cause any kind of debate with these numbers. These are numbers that are generally recognized when talking about ag irrigation. Generally, ag irrigation in the United States, a number that is widely recognized, though debatable, accounts for 70% of freshwater withdrawals. Today, there are approximately 7 billion people on the planet. In 2050, approximately 9 billion people on the planet. How are we going to sustain a safe and reliable food supply for those that are living in the United States? How will the Ogallala be a part of that? In future webinars, we'll be looking at the Colorado River Basin in this same aspect. How will that be a sustainable water supply for the future of American agriculture? In 2050, 70% more food will be needed. That translates up to 100% more food in developing nations. So not only will there be strain in the United States for this food, fuel, feed, and fiber, but there will be strain coming from outside of our borders as well. And what role does the United States have in producing that for our developing nations? There is potential to increase yield while being more efficient with your resources, whether it's water, chemicals, et cetera, you name it. Whatever resources you have, become more efficient, more yield from American agriculture. This is widely recognized with the USDA. The reason why I highlight these right here, because it talks about really how much yield is coming from pressurized irrigation and where potential exists. And there's a lot of potential out there. And when we talk about the Ogallala, we're looking at increasing our yield while sustaining the Ogallala Aquifer. What's been done so far, what's being done now, and where are we going in the future? Real quick, this is a great snapshot that shows exactly what we're talking about here. In 1961, there was about 1.4 million hectares of agriculture globally. This equates to about 0.45 hectares per person. So if you were around in 1961, many of us were, you had 0.45 hectares for you globally that you can enjoy gaining your agricultural yield, food, feed, fuel, and fiber from. In 2008, due to an increase in global population, this has decreased to about 0.23 hectares per person globally, which means that you are getting the same amount, if not more, benefits from agriculture per hectare than what we were in 1961. So it's a pretty good graphic to show that, irrigated agriculture has only increased a little bit. The amount has generally stayed the same. It's increased a little bit, leveled off in the early 2000s. But really, it's a good story to tell, and one that needs to be in the back of our minds whenever we're talking about agriculture and or water policy. We'll be focusing a lot on Nebraska today in the Ogallala Aquifer. We're looking forward to the new Farm and Ranch Irrigation Survey coming out. The latest one from 2008 showed that irrigated acres was 8.4 million in 2008 in Nebraska. That's, as far as irrigated acres go, they were number one. But you look at number 3, Texas. They're a big part of this aquifer as well. So 5.4 million. So to the top 5, 2 of those states basically reside over the Ogallala Aquifer. Where do we get our water from? Right now, this was taken in, as of 2005, surface water 58%, groundwater 42%. This changes regularly, I understand, but really it's a good way to look at what are the sources of irrigation? Where do we get our water from? Both are becoming more and more, they're not as readily available as they once were. And if we get drought, as you're seeing in California, and you start digging for groundwater, how does that affect the groundwater supply? All of these things need to be considered when looking at, when talking about these policies. And finally, looking at the western states in particular, looking at overall total water use in irrigation from 1984 to 2008, again, it's generally stayed the same. But then you look at the irrigated acres for gravity versus the irrigated acres versus pressurized irrigation, which includes sprinkler, pivot, drip, micro, etc. Pressurized irrigation is on the increase, and gravity irrigation is on the decrease. Total water use has remained the same, but our agricultural yields have increased exponentially. And that would be the next line we put in this graph is what are our agricultural yields from 1984 to 2008, looking at the overall water use versus the type of irrigation used. So those are very big picture items that we look at every day when viewing irrigated agriculture. And today we're very excited to look at the Ogallala Aquifer in particular, very specifically. And our first speaker is Jim Gakey. He's an emeritus research hydrologist with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, who I've been told is the person to talk to. Whenever I ask somebody in and around the Ogallala, who is the person to talk to when looking at what's going on in the Ogallala versus water use, agriculture, etc., his name was brought up several times. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this presentation over to him now. So Jim, I'm going to give you control of this right now. So Jim, take it away.
All right, I'm trying. Am I on?
You are on. Take it away.
All right. Thanks, John, for that nice introduction. Today I'm going to talk about the Ogallala Formation and the High Plains Aquifer. I'm going to break my talk into 3 parts: the Ogallala and other associated aquifers in Nebraska, the USGS High Plains Regional Aquifer Systems Analysis, Interpretations and Implications, and the rest of the story in Nebraska and the hope for the future. Our story starts with a look at how things looked at 65 million years ago when the Western Interior Seaway covered Nebraska. 65 million years ago, the Rocky Mountains were uplifted through this ocean and achieved heights of 25 to 35,000 feet high, and immediately were attacked by erosion, shedding sediments to the west and to the east, and eventually those sediments got to and built up Nebraska and provided the materials we see today. If you look at the word interior, Nebraska is beneath the RIOR, that is Nebraska. This is a picture of the type locality of the Ogallala Formation. It was named in 1898 by N.H. Darden for this outcrop 3 miles east of Ogallala, Nebraska. It is typified by a cap rock, a cemented sandstone, and it contains a wide variety of materials, basically sandstones and sands. It can also contain sands and gravels, siltstones and clay stones, a variety of materials typical for an alluvial aquifer. If we look at the time chart for Nebraska, we can see down at the bottom 65 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous, the Rocky Mountains began to be uplifted, and it took 28 million years for the sediments to reach Nebraska and started to be developed. Our oldest aquifer in Nebraska is the Brule Aquifer, and that is sort of a misnomer because the Brule is a massive siltstone or clay stone, and normally is considered the base of the aquifer, but in the area of Sidney, Nebraska, the Brule is cracked, and the cracks provide water, so it's considered a minor aquifer. 70% of the Brule is volcanic ash, interestingly. Above the Brule is the Aquifer Formation. It can get to 300 feet thick in western Nebraska. It's a fine-grained sandstone, silty, and above that is the Ogallala Formation. The Ogallala was deposited between 19 million and 5 million years ago. It covers most of Nebraska. It is our highest consolidated bedrock aquifer. As I said, it has cap rock, and it includes a variety of sediments characteristic of an alluvial depositional sequence. Above that, we have the unconsolidated Pliocene broadwater gravels. They can be 100 to 200 feet thick. And finally, we have the Pleistocene gravels in southeastern Nebraska, all in hydraulic connection. This is the geologic bedrock of Nebraska. You can see the yellow of the Ogallala that covers most of Nebraska. This is the primary bedrock in Nebraska, and you can see on the bottom we have a cross-section that shows the Ogallala as a veneer of sediments over the surface, and underlain by the shales of the pure shale, which was the basin, the base of the interior seaway. And if you see on the south, you can see the Republican River has cut through the Ogallala, cut down to the Cretaceous bedrock. That means that anything that happens in Nebraska stays in Nebraska. A lot of people think that pumping in Nebraska might affect Texas, and pumping in Texas would affect Nebraska, but it can't, because the Republican River has cut off the Ogallala in Nebraska. This map shows test holes in Nebraska. Most of the Ogallala in Nebraska is buried, so we have to drill test holes to really appreciate the extent of the subsurface in the Ogallala. If we look at a cross-section across the middle of the state from A to A prime, we can see these sediments there. If we look at you can see the Brule Formation in the brown, overlain by the Aquifer in places, and then the Ogallala extending about almost all across the state. It can be 1,000 feet thick in places. You can see the yellow of the alluvial sands and gravels, the broadwater, and overlain by the alluvial sands, the Quaternary Pliocene sands. So that means we have the potential of 4 or 5 aquifer units in Nebraska. If we look at a north to south cross-section from South Dakota to Kansas, we can see, I apologize for the different colors, but the Brule Formation in pink, the Aquifer in green, the Ogallala light blue, the broadwater gravels in brown, and then the sands and silts in sort of a gray-green. And if you notice on this, you can see them on the north side and the right side, the Niobrara River is cut down into the Ogallala, and you have outcrops there. And on the right side, left side, you can see the outcrops adjacent to the Platte. And if you go further to the left, you can see that the Republican River is cut down through the Ogallala and is exposed the Cretaceous bedrock in the surface, the base of the Republican River. The thing you want to look about this is there are very few outcrops of the Ogallala. To be able to appreciate the Ogallala, we have to drill test holes to appreciate the extent and the composition of the aquifer. This is our earliest test drilling rig for the Conservation and Survey Division when the USGS and the Conservation and Survey Division got together and started drilling test holes in 1930. 80 years later, this is our current modern test drilling program. If you notice, there's a green Prius there. That green Prius belongs to William Ashworth. William Ashworth wrote the book Ogallala Blue, and he wanted me to take him out and show him the type locality of the Ogallala. I suggested instead of showing him the outcrop, he should come up to northwestern Arthur County and be part of a test drilling program that would drill down to and through the Ogallala, and he could actually see how it came out of the ground when it produced water instead of looking at a dry outcrop. This test hole was drilled on the John Jensen Ranch, and John Jensen apologized to me because we set up just east of his irrigation well, and he said, that's a poor well. And I said, what do you mean poor well? And he says, it only pumps 2,400 gallons a minute. And I said, 2,400 gallons a minute is great. And he says, but the well up the valley pumps 3,000 gallons a minute. And the irony of that is the well he had that pumped 2,400 gallons a minute was 260 feet deep, and they drilled the well until they hit the top of the Ogallala. And they treated the top of the Ogallala as the base of the aquifer. By the time they drilled the well 260 feet deep, they had penetrated 100 feet of saturated sands and gravels of the Broadwater Formation sitting on top of the Ogallala. That's why we had to drill this test hole to find out how thick the Ogallala was below his 260-foot deep irrigation well. We drilled this test hole 960 feet, almost 700 feet below this irrigation well, and we encountered more gravel in the Ogallala than was above it. In the middle of nowhere, there's an ocean of water in Nebraska. This is how the gravel looks from about 200 feet down in the well. This gravel represents the Rocky Mountains. We're standing on top of the Rocky Mountains, actually. This sand and gravel would yield 20 gallons per minute per saturated foot. With 100 foot, this gravel above the Ogallala would produce 2,000 gallons a minute easily. This sample came up from about 500 feet down. This is a typical Ogallala sandstone representative. You can see the white areas in here. Those are replaced siliceous rootlets that were remains of the debris, the plant material that lived and grew into time. And oftentimes we'll find replaced hackberry seeds and grass seeds replaced from the material that lived there 10 or 15 million years ago. If we look at the state of Nebraska, I started in 1970, and we had 3,533 test holes when I started in 1970. By 1980, we had 4,155 test holes, and you can see many of those test holes were drilled in western Nebraska, and that's when, because I had the opportunity to oversee the test drilling program, and I got a chance to see personally, up close and personal, the varied nature of the Ogallala time and time again. Currently, we have about 5,600 test holes across the state of Nebraska, which looks like a lot, but it boils down to about one test hole every 14 square miles, and that just represents a good start at understanding the complexities of the aquifers in Nebraska. In addition to the test holes, we've got logs of irrigation wells. In 1958 in Nebraska, we required the drilling test hole wells to turn in test hole logs. So in 1970, we had 36,000 irrigation wells, and everyone had a log associated with that, providing us subsurface information. By 1980, we'd almost doubled the number of irrigation wells in Nebraska, and the 1970s were the golden era of drilling in Nebraska. We drilled more irrigation wells from 1970 to 1980 than we drilled before that. Because we had a lot of center pivots. This map just shows the center pivots in 1972 and compared to the center pivots in 1984. We've been very, very busy in Nebraska. Currently, we have over 100,000 irrigation wells in Nebraska, as shown by this picture. And as of 1980, we had problems. In 1980, we had declines from 20 to 40 feet in the water table in southwestern Nebraska, southeast Nebraska, and northwestern Nebraska, even northeastern Nebraska. Things looked very dire as the result of the pumping of these irrigation wells. Enter the USGS. The USGS from 1978 to 1992 initiated 25 regional aquifer systems analysis, and number 2 was the High Plains Aquifer. The High Plains Regional Aquifer Systems Analysis looked at the conditions in High Plains Aquifer as of 1980, and they published their results in a series of publications as U.S. Geological Survey Professional Paper 1400s A, B, C, D, and E. The High Plains Aquifer underlies 174,000 square miles in 8 states. In 1980, 20% of the irrigated land in the United States was in the High Plains area, and 30% of the groundwater pumped in the United States was pumped in the High Plains Aquifer area. 170,000 wells pumped almost 18 million acre-feet to irrigate 14 million acres. Wow, that is impressive. One of the primary authors, Ed Gutentag, commented to me, he felt like a little kid in a candy store when he got to Nebraska because we had so much subsurface information. It was just a thrill for him to work in Nebraska. The first thing he did was draw a pre-development contour map, flow contour map, and it basically confirmed that we all knew that the groundwater moves from west to east across the area. They looked at the precipitation. The precipitation varied from 33 inches in the west to less than 12 inches in the west, and they estimated recharge across the area. The only source of recharge was precipitation, and they estimated that varied from 2 to 3/100ths of an inch in Texas and New Mexico to 5 or 6 inches in Nebraska and in Kansas. That's orders of magnitude more, and you can anticipate differences. They looked at the geologic units involved, and if it weren't for Nebraska, they could have just called it the Ogallala Aquifer. But in Nebraska, as I explained earlier, we have the Brule and the Rickery older than the Ogallala, and then the overlying broadwater gravels and the Pleistocene sands and gravels to the east, all in hydraulic connection. The Ogallala actually covers 77% of the area as it is set, but we had to call it the High Plains Aquifer to include all those units in Nebraska. They looked at the saturated thickness in 1980 and noticed the greens, the reds, greens, and blues from 200 to 1,200 feet of saturated thickness in Nebraska. And notice in the southern portion of Texas, the saturated thickness was 0 to 200 feet. That comes in just a little bit. As of 1980, they had 3.25 billion acre-feet of drainable water in storage. 66% of that was in Nebraska, 12% in Texas, 10% in Kansas. They looked at the water level change from pre-development to 1980. Now keep in mind that irrigation started in Texas in the 1940s and didn't start in earnest in Nebraska until the 1970s. So in Texas they had declines from 40 to 50 to almost over 100 feet, while in Nebraska we had rises and declines, but we had they essentially canceled out. As of 1980, they had 166 million acre-feet of depletions. 70% of those depletions were in Texas, 16% in Kansas, and Nebraska had 0 declines as of 1980. They chose to do a crude model. They did a model for the northern High Plains, the central High Plains, and the southern High Plains. They used a grid model of 10 square miles, and they looked at 2 scenarios from 1980 to 2020 about if we continue to develop the resource as we had, what would happen. And they predicted declines in Nebraska from orange, which would be 50 to 100 feet, to red for over 100 feet. You can see a lot of declines in Nebraska over 100 feet, and also down in Texas, in northern Texas and southwestern Kansas. The second scenario assumed that the irrigators would address or adopt best management practices, and even adopting best management practices, there were still prediction of declines from 50 to 100 feet across southern Nebraska and down in Texas. In 1987, the USGS started to report the conditions biannually of water level changes in the High Plains Aquifer. This is the most current report, and it's the conditions in the aquifer. It's 2011, and you can see down in Texas they had declines of over 150 feet. This in the area where they had 100 to 200 feet of saturated thickness. That is more than 3/4 of the aquifer gone. And yet you look at Nebraska, they predicted 50 to 100 foot declines, and instead we have rises, probably because we had above normal precipitation, and we actually instituted groundwater controls starting in 1980. So we've been very fortunate in Nebraska. They looked at the cumulative change of water and storage in the High Plains Aquifer, and people look at this and panic. They can see by 1980 they depleted the groundwater supply by 150 million acre-feet, and it has dropped to 275 million feet. And people look at this and figure, wow, we're running out of water, and they panic. But if you look at the change of water and storage in the High Plains Aquifer, it's dire for Texas and Kansas, but not in Nebraska. The most current assessment shows that actually there's an increase in water in Nebraska. So what's the big deal? What's the concern about in Nebraska? The concern is you don't have to deplete an aquifer too much to affect stream flows. You can just take it off the top, and you can have an impact on surface water flows, and that's been the problem in Nebraska. In the Republican Valley, development has impaired the tributaries of the Republican Valley, the Republican River, and the Platte River, and those areas are of grave concern in Nebraska. If we look at Nebraska from pre-development to 2012, we've got a lot of rises. If you remember, I showed you this situation as of 1980. It's not as bad at all because we had above normal precipitation in the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. And if you look at the corner, you can see the the rainfall from 2007 to 2012, it was well above normal, and then in 2012, we turned off the spigot. This map shows the water level as of the spring of 2012, and after that, we had a flash drought, and we only had 13 inches of rain in 2012. So if we look at the water level change, our most current water level change map in Nebraska, you can see that the declines have broadened, but still not it's not as nearly as bad as it was in 1980. If we look at the aquifers across Nebraska, you can see the blue of the High Plains aquifer, and you can see the paleo aquifers in eastern Nebraska and the Dakota aquifers. We have additional aquifers in addition to the High Plains aquifer. Getting back to the High Plains aquifer, you can see this is the outline of the High Plains aquifer. You can see the Brule in tan on the west, the Hatcher of the tan and blue of the Rickery in northern western Nebraska, the stippled pattern for the Ogallala, the darker blue of the broadwater gravels that overlie the Ogallala, and the blues of the Pleistocene sands and gravels to the southeast. Now look at this. You can see the broadwater gravels, and I have to make a comment about the Keystone XL pipeline. Forgive me, but a lot of people in Nebraska are very concerned about the pipeline and the leakage from the pipeline affecting the water supply in Nebraska. Originally, the pathway was the black dotted line, and we went through the sandhills, and this was an area of high water tables, and they would actually have had to put the pipeline into the water table. So to avoid the sandhills, they rerouted the sandhills around the sandhills. And keep in mind that groundwater moves from west to east, so 80% of the 80% of the groundwater in Nebraska lies to the west of the pipeline. So any leak from the pipeline can't flow upstream. So there's 80% of the water in Nebraska is safe from any leak. And when they rerouted the pipeline, they rerouted the pipeline so it is 50 feet above the water table, and the fine-grained sediments in the unsaturated zone would keep any leakage from getting to the water table, so that the water table is not at risk. And people that would say that the groundwater in Nebraska is at risk from the pipeline leaking are mistaken. But we should be concerned about groundwater pollution potential. This map shows the elements of groundwater pollution potential. The yellow is coarse textured sandy soils. The pink is high water areas of high water tables, and the blue is intensive irrigation and use of chemicals. You combine all three, and you can develop significant pollution or potential. And if you look at nitrates, you can see this. The maximum contaminant is 10 parts per million. You can see the oranges and reds of potential from contamination in areas where you have high water tables, coarse textured soils, and irrigated agriculture. Same with atrazine. Atrazine is the most common herbicide used in Nebraska, and any atrazine in the water is a problem. You can see the areas where it exceeds the maximum contaminant level of 3 parts per billion. How do we deal with this in Nebraska? We established natural resources districts in 1972. They are staffed by local elected directors, and they, in 1970, passed the Groundwater Management Act that entrusted to the NRD's management of the groundwater, and it provided that they could establish control areas. And in fact, they established control areas in the Upper Republican, Middle Republican, Lower Republican, and the Central Platte, and South Platte, North Platte, and Upper Niobrara White. In those control areas, they could establish moratoriums, they could require meters, they could establish allocations, and they did that starting in 1980 in the Upper Republican NRD. They actually, from 1980, they went from 22 inches for an allocation down to 13 inches historically. And that is a very good start. Believe it or not, in 1996 in Nebraska, we had a debate about about either whether and surface water and groundwater are connected. And we passed LD 198, the conjunctive use bill that recognized the connection between surface and groundwater. That was a long time coming, and it was a surprise to me that it was even a debated question. In 2004, we passed the Integrated Management Act for the control of hydrologically connected waters. LB 962 provided that the NRDs managing groundwater under correlative rights would work with the Department of Natural Resources that managed surface water under prior appropriations, and they would develop integrated management plans to deal with the conditions of over and fully appropriated areas in Nebraska. This map shows the fully appropriated areas in light blue and over appropriated areas in checkered blue. And every one of those NRDs had to develop an integrated management plan to deal with the surface and groundwater conditions and deal with them in the right way. We have currently, we just passed, I guess last week, LD 1098. It was landmark legislation. It provides $32 million over the next 2 years for water projects, plus $11 million per year in the future for research. It revamped the Natural Resources Commission from 16 to 27 members and requires the 3 Republican NRDs to develop a basin-wide water management plan. To date, the NRDs could develop their individual groundwater or integrated management plans, but they didn't have to work together. The bill LB 1098 requires that the 3 Republican NRDs come up with a basin-wide water management plan coordinated to take advantage, to take provision for the groundwater and surface water users, and that's a very good step in the right direction. Step in the right direction also is our test drilling program. This is a helicopter flying a probe, and the probe sends out a signal. The signal penetrates the ground and sends a return signal, and it is essentially drilling a hole every 9 feet. It sends to a depth of 300 meters, and this technique allows us to correlate between test holes and provide a lot of improved information to the test hole programs that have test holes 3 to 6 miles apart. This provides us much better information for our models to fill in those holes across Nebraska. In addition, we have optically stimulated luminescent dating. In the past, we had to look for buried soils and carbon-14 dates to date the depositional sequences in Nebraska. Using optically simulated luminescent dating, we can tell when a grain of sand has been last exposed to light, and using this technique, we can explain the depositional sequences across Nebraska, and it will unlock a lot of histories and stories about Nebraska's deposition. In Nebraska, we've got a tremendous amount of data. The data becomes information, that information becomes knowledge, the knowledge becomes intelligence, and finally, given all that basic data, we are able to make wise decisions. And I think we're making wise decisions based on our data and are improving our data to make further wise decisions in the future. I am optimistic. This is a sunrise in the Sandhills. I am optimistic for the future of Nebraska. This is another sunrise in the Sandhills. I am convinced that our good data in Nebraska is a good future for the water resources in Nebraska. That's all I have, John.
Jim, that was great. Hopefully we're all a bit wiser after that very detailed and very interesting presentation. So I will go ahead and prepare to introduce Chittaranjan here. Chittaranjan Ray is the director of the Nebraska Water Center. And before I introduce Chittaranjan, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping things. If anybody has any questions whatsoever, please type them into the question toolbar as part of the GoToWebinar application. We will go ahead and have a Q&A period after Chittaranjan's presentation. So please, if you have any questions about anything that was discussed either through Jim's presentation or from Chittaranjan's presentation here coming up, please type that into the toolbar, and we'll go ahead and have a brief Q&A session after Chittaranjan's presentation. So Chittaranjan Ray is the director of the Nebraska Water Center, which is part of the Robert B. Doherty Water for Food Institute. I have attended a few of the Water for Food conferences that the Institute has put together over the past few years. Great data, great discussion, and they are a major player, a major conduit of information, along with the Irrigation Association and others, in driving the discussion related to water use in the Ogallala Aquifer. So I've invited Chittaranjan to come and speak a little bit about what the Institute is doing, about what they're seeing, etc. So Chittaranjan, I'm going to go ahead and give you control of the presentation now.
Okay, John, thank you very much. I have maybe 10 or 12 minutes of presentation. So are you able to see now the first slide?
Yes, we're all good.
Okay. So let me know when you are ready.
You're all set, man. Whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay, okay. So as John mentioned, the Nebraska Water Center is a part of the Robert B. Doherty Water for Food Institute. So let me take about 10 minutes or so to go over the institute and how we work locally and globally. So this institute happened because of a sizable gift from Robert B. Doherty Charitable Foundation. So Doherty was the founder of the Valley Irrigation Company, and now it's Valmont Industries in Omaha. So before he passed away, he made this gift to the University of Nebraska system. The overall vision was to help the world use, as I read from this slide, its limited freshwater resources effectively to ensure food security for the current and future generations. He was a very generous man, actually, so that's what he was always worried about, the issues around the globe, that how this 7 billion and upcoming 9 billion people are going to be fed, basically with dwindling freshwater supplies. So University of Nebraska was very lucky to receive this money, and then they set up this institute, and the mission, here the 4 points I will go over. Transforming the management of water for a food security, that was his goal or vision. So conducting educational programs as well as scientific and policy research using the results for policy decisions. So then other thing is creating local and global partnerships for extending or expanding the knowledge base, and that's where we can come up with effective solutions. And then the third is developing advanced decision-making tools or knowledge delivery systems. And now the big data is becoming also part of agriculture. That's where the university is trying to capitalize. And finally, educating the human talent necessary to solve the problems of the future. So organizationally, the institute reports directly to the president, and the executive director, he came from the World Bank, Roberto Lenton, very well respected, a PhD from MIT. He was, before World Bank, he was the Director General of International Water Management Institute in Sri Lanka for 9 years or so. Before that, Ford Foundation in India for 6 years or so. Very well respected person. So that really got me excited to seek for this job as the Nebraska Water Center Director. So I report directly to him. And we have a fantastic water sciences lab since 1990 or so. It's about 15, I would say maybe a little bit 15 plus years. So that's under me with 5 to 6 staff members. Then there are 3 other directors, 2 have been recruited. The director for research, Christopher Neely, he came from Utah State. And the director for policy, he just accepted the offer and starts in July from University of Illinois, Nick Brozovic. And we are now looking for a director of communications. So the operational plans for 2013 to 2015, basically, as I mentioned earlier, scientific and policy research on increasing production, and production means food production, and ensuring sustainability, both quantity quality side. Then the quantitative analysis and modeling and mapping to improve policy making and the education of the young talents. And finally, we do this Water for Food conference, what John mentioned. And this coming year conference will be in Seattle, partly hosted by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in October of 2014. So I earlier mentioned the institute has both local and global focus. Global is the main thing, and the Nebraska Water Center is the local arm of the institute, which looks into the Nebraska or local issues. So basically building bridges across the world for large holders and small holder agriculture. So for an example that we know the sprinkler irrigation is highly efficient for food production. So one project right now we are exploring with Valmont Industries, basically the donor itself in Tanzania, that how small holders holding a couple of acres of land can be combined together to go for a larger sprinkler system. So that way I'll come to that later on. There is a yield gap project we are working in that regard. And then bridging different communities of expertise and focus, especially water, ag, and livestock communities. So both John and Jim mentioned about the irrigation in Nebraska. So it's Nebraska is now #1, surpassing California in terms of irrigated acreage. And right now about 110 to 115,000 irrigation wells. So the lower right-hand side map shows the locations of these wells, high density. And if you look at the irrigated acreage in Nebraska, they are same as Egypt. And of course, in this map, we are not showing the irrigated acreage in India and China, because they will be much higher, of course, those 2 countries. And of course, China has put a curb on expanding the land for irrigation because scarcity of resources. But India is still, trying to expand more land for irrigation. But those 2 countries primarily focus on surface irrigation, not much pressurized irrigation. And then Jim mentioned about the natural resource districts. That's kind of wonderful thing about that those formed in 1972 and 23 of them with local taxing power and the locally elected boards. So that basically, as Jim's slides mentioned, they control the groundwater issues. And one good thing University of Nebraska has been doing that there is a faculty member with support from the Institute for Agriculture and Natural Resources and the Natural Resource Districts, NRDs. He has developed this Nebraska Ag Water Management Network. So with sensors and computing technology and other things, they are trying to reduce the water use for our producers or farmers. So now about 500,000 acres in the state use this network managing the irrigation. And the institute, as I mentioned, that we are in the leadership-wise 4 to 5 people, but it's really distributed across the university as well as globe, I would say. So it draws faculty from all the 4 campuses as fellows, affiliates, and also draws other resources as necessary to function. Then we have created some very nice international arrangements for our faculty affiliation as well as for grant making, and also for a lot of other partnerships with USAID or FAO type organizations. So in the last year or so, we are going through 3 major steps within our university system. There are 3 programs within the institute. One is called Path to Solutions. So where the institute poses specific and well-defined research challenge to the University of Nebraska community. So this is where grants are given to the faculty or students. The second is a venture research, where someone comes up with a high-risk or exploratory idea, and then they seek for some funding. And the third is a transdisciplinary conversation, where faculty members or visitors from various other places come, and there's an exchange and also develop some sort of scholarly community among the students and the faculty. So today, in fact, is the last one for the semester. It takes place once a month. So the partnership building, I'm going to go through some of the things which are in place right now. So UNESCO IHE, there is a joint master's program between the Institute of Hydraulic Engineering in Delft as well as University of Nebraska. So students spend a year in Delft, another year in Nebraska. So the Water for Food is providing funding for that. The second is FAO. This is again a collaboration to increase the crop yield and the yield gap atlas, which I'll be showing a little bit later. The third is a Jain irrigation company, primarily a drip irrigation company in India, forming partnership and especially working with smallholders. Then in Brazil, another partnership, University of Sao Paulo. Then USAID, of course, for Middle East and North Africa. Then a partnership with China has already started. So basically, the initial program locations are, of course, the state of Nebraska, 1 or more states in India, 1 or more states in Brazil, 1 or more provinces in China, and a limited number of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and Middle East. So, of course, we cannot solve everybody's problems with this money we have. So one of the flagship programs is the development of the global crop yield gap and the water productivity atlas. So what is yield gap? It's basically what is the maximum attainable yield and what is the current yield, and that way we see what, and that, so that means that with the proper hybrids, available water and nutrients, what can be the potential yield at a location and what the farmer is getting right now. So that's how we're graphically trying to do this. It's right now funded jointly by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and some other funding from the USAID. So this information is going to be publicly available, and the initial project is for about 4 years. And this is going to be a really valuable information for policymakers, researchers, students, and basically, industry. So one map here you can see, this is going from northern Tanzania to basically Kenya and parts of Ethiopia. That the more the red, that means the gap is more, and less reddish color, the gap is less. These are in tons per hectare. So it will show that there is potential to grow more food in the areas with darker color. But of course, it's going to involve few other things, that provided there is no short change in getting the nutrients, especially the fertilizers, and then there is available water resources to irrigate the crops. So these are those information will be gradually built into this system. There's another thing I'm not going to show a map for. This is going on is developing drought resistance hybrids or crops, especially for either for a salt tolerance or a drought. So there's a project going on, the Water for Food Institute had funded, and now that was supplemented by a NSF grant of almost $750,000 to one of the researchers here. So that's where we see that the findings can be easily transferable to sub-Saharan Africa or parts of India who are primarily rain-fed agriculture with a lot of drought stresses. And the same faculty is also trying to look at gene pools of crops, especially rice paddy in extended flooded areas, especially in India or where the tall rice plants can be 5 to 6 feet, and especially trying to emerge out of water. So this is where we see the local and the global partnerships. And with that, I'm going to stop, and maybe we should be ready to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Chittaranjan, for that very helpful information on what the Institute is doing. Let's see here. I apologize about this. Let me get to the right. All right. So what we have now is a Q&A session. Before we start, we have about 5 minutes for a Q&A session. A lot of great questions have been asked, and I want to get to as many as possible. I'm not going to get to everyone's, though. I've included our speakers' email addresses here. What we're going to do after this webinar is being recorded, and it will be placed on our website, irrigation.org/webinar_series, and I'll include that in an upcoming slide as well. And I'm also getting copies of their presentations to put that on our website as well. So you'll have a full recording of this website as well as copies of their presentation. In the next couple of days, they will be available. But I want to just capture some general questions that are somewhat similar. And I'll ask these for both of you, just really short, concise answers if possible. And I'll start out with Jim first. I think that this is pretty interesting. There's been a lot of questions about aquifers going dry, specifically in Texas, parts of Kansas. And the specific question is, if the Ogallala goes dry in Texas, as it appears to be doing, will it have any effect on the aquifer in Nebraska? And then along with that, there's a lot of questions on recharge regarding if an aquifer goes dry, the ability to recharge, and what is encompassed there, what's included there, or possibilities with recharging aquifers. But I'll start out with the effect that other parts of the aquifer has on Nebraska agriculture and irrigation, and then the second part of the question.
Well, physically, if the aquifer goes dry in Texas, it's not going to affect Nebraska physically at all. It might affect Nebraska economically because it would put more emphasis on the irrigated agriculture in Nebraska, but physically what goes on in Texas can't affect Nebraska.
And then, so if how about recharge? And there's been some questions about the amount of irrigation applied. How much does that go into recharge in the aquifer? If areas of the aquifer does go dry, is there ability to be recharged at that point?
Given time, yes. The recharge would, you have to stop and think that it has taken maybe thousands of years to recharge to get the water there. We can pump it out in a matter of years. Given time, it can be replaced.
Perfect. And the next one, I'll start with Chittaranjan here, and then maybe go to Jim afterwards with this question. There's a lot of we've highlighted a lot of good practices here being done in Nebraska, and the story that's being told out there about the Ogallala is that it is in a dire situation, and that it is all going dry. So I know that the Water for Food Institute, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and other institutes are trying to tell a good story about the Ogallala, about what's being done. But in your opinion, in your time so far with the Institute, what do you see as opportunities for us to tell this good story that's out there, about getting the story straight on what exactly is going on in the Ogallala?
John, this is a very good question, and also the New York Times article you might have seen recently, that's also stirring some emotions or opinions all around the country. As I'm so new, I am glad that Jim gave the nice presentation on the aquifer condition itself. But from the point of view of the community and the institute here, basically we want to work scientifically with what is available, the USGS and the partnering states also. Like there's a recent proposal we put with Colorado State and Oklahoma State to look at a gradient of locations where things are happening differently. And we are also trying to partner with Kansas State. There was a recent article about the same issue in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. So it's all looking at site-specific conditions, that what is causing the difference. So Nebraska may not be at as dire situation as Kansas or Oklahoma or things, and plus the other things, that high efficiency irrigation management, the hybrids or genetic improvements, all these things what Nebraska is doing, hopefully those will be helpful also.
Excellent. Guys, we're up on the hour here, and we have a lot of other questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the questions that have been typed in. I'm going to get them to our speakers. I encourage those of you who have typed in questions to engage with the speakers directly. Like I said, their emails are up on this screen, and their presentations will be available on our website. Just for future reference, the website address is located at the bottom of this screen. So it's irrigation.org/webinar_series. Copies of our previous webinars are on there, as well as a schedule for upcoming webinars, as well as copies of this webinar as well. So I encourage you to engage with our speakers. I will take down all of this, all the questions, and make sure that you get copies of these questions as well. And with that, there's my contact information. I'd like to thank both Jim and Chittaranjan for an excellent presentation, and hopefully we'll see all of you on one of our future webinars. So thank you very much.